Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Anil Gokhale, and I work at Toronto Foundation. I'm really, really happy to be here today. We're going to have a conversation today about family philanthropy and ways that we can engage the next gen. We've done a lot of work at Toronto Foundation in this regard, and I'm going to sort of start out by telling you a bit of that journey, and then I'm going to have some friends join me up on stage, and they're going to go through some more examples and details, and then we'll get into a bit of a conversation together. I would definitely like to start with a land acknowledgement. I've borrowed this land acknowledgement from our friends at the Montreal Community Foundation. I'd like to highlight that we are on the traditional territories of the Ganawage peoples, and often when I do land acknowledgements in Toronto, the words are on the screen for all of us to take in and read. I like to sort of add a little bit more, which is just about sort of a connection to my upbringing, which is I'm the child of immigrants from India. I grew up in a suburb of Toronto called Scarborough, and product of the public school system all throughout. And probably until I was, I don't know, in my early to mid 30s, was really the first time I'd sort of heard about what happened with Indigenous peoples in this country. And for me, that's something that it's unfortunate that that's kind of how we were brought up and what we learned. But I now look at it through the eyes of my children, who are 7 and 11 now, and how much they get exposed to at school, and then how that all comes back to us as well. So I'm really proud of where things are going in cities across this country, and obviously we need to do more and more and more. But that's just a piece that I think is really, really important. And I want to acknowledge the Decolonizing Wealth was mentioned yesterday as a book that I would highly recommend you all have a look at if you haven't. And then I also want to give a shout to The Circle. They are a member of PFC, and they run a program called the Partners in Reciprocity. Myself and some colleagues at Toronto Foundation took part in it a couple years ago. If you're not aware of it, I encourage you to look it up. I think it would be a great addition to your continued learning. So with me today for this conversation are a few great friends. Hello? Okay. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Tiffany Chamandi, is not able to join us. So I've got some of her notes, and we're going to try to intersperse that as much as we can. But joining me, and I'll do proper introductions in a few moments, are Sherilyn Hale and Narinder Dhami, and then we're going to get into a conversation. And we'd love to really just engage all of you in this conversation as well. For us at Toronto Foundation, the work of engaging next-gen families really started with a focus on our vision, which is to create a city of informed and engaged philanthropists, accelerating meaningful change for all. And that is sort of different than a vision statement that you would hear from sort of our old vision statement, and also vision statements for community foundations and other charitable organizations. And it's really at its core is trying to create this network of philanthropists that are informed and engaged. But more importantly, it's around that accelerating meaningful change and that go forward. We have a purpose as well, which I think underpins all of this. And it's really around mobilizing those with resources to partner with others and creating a more fair and just society. And that's at its core. And all of that really, this work started about 5 years ago for us to go down this path. And all of that has really set us up really well to go on this next-gen engagement journey. I have some stats. There are thousands of stats about next-gen giving and thousands of reports and like just so much. And so I picked a couple. Of course, there are lots more, and I'd love to hear any from all of you as well. One of them here around sort of the focus on trusting charities. I think this is an interesting piece that we'll probably dive into a little bit as well through the conversation, just around the difference in trust related to charities from the different age cohorts. And what's nice about that is we heard this term yesterday as well around trust-based philanthropy. And I think there's a real connection with the direction that philanthropy is going and what we're trying to do more of with families. And so this is a real focus of ours through the work that we're doing with engaging families with their philanthropy. Sorry, these graphs are a bit small, but essentially what they're saying is the biggest graph is showing that over a 3-year period, 2006, 15, and 19, giving across all generations is going down. And then the two smaller graphs really get into, and sorry, the bigger graph really looks at giving that's on tax filings. The two smaller graphs look at other forms of engagement. So the top one is about showing support through activism and really getting involved through protest, et cetera. And that is up for the younger generations. And then the one on the bottom is around engaging in things like crowdfunding, which is also up for smaller or younger generations. And so I think it's interesting just to see that. And we've heard some commentary around giving to non-qualified donees yesterday. And so it's just sort of things to be thinking about and be sort of packaging up in your head just as we have this conversation. This stat is about 5 years old now, so I don't have the current number. But what I would underscore here is just that giving in this country is not equitable, and a large percentage of donations in this country go to a small percentage of organizations. Generally, it's the largest organizations, and many of the grassroots organizations, some of which I think we're going to see this afternoon on our site visits here in Montreal, many of which are located in cities across this country, don't get that same share, and so. As a community foundation, one of the things we're trying to do is really open people's eyes to these kinds of opportunities. I'm going to just spend a few more minutes now talking about the journey that we went on at Toronto Foundation. I said it started all around engaging and focusing on vision. The whole idea was we in 2017, so 5 years ago, we looked at our donor base, and it was very reflective of boardrooms in Bay Street and did not necessarily reflect the city that we lived in. And we thought about this and we said, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to try to find a new group of individuals and families that we want to be engaging that's more reflective of our city? And it all started in 2018 with this idea of creating this program called Vision 2020. And the whole idea, the way I often describe it, is as a philanthropic MBA program. And the model is really that we created a curriculum and we went out and we found under 45-year-olds, essentially is kind of how we focused it, Millennials and Gen Xers primarily. It was the children of some of our fund holders. It was professional advisors in the community. It was just kind of other folks at large that were in our networks that we just made connections with. And we set a goal to attract 50 to join us that first year. And by the end of sort of that first year, we ended up recruiting 117 to join, which was really exciting and something that we definitely weren't expecting, but it just catapulted. And you can see since then, there's been other versions of this program, Vision Next, and then we sort of had a bit of a name change, Class of 2021, Class of 2022, and then this coming January, we'll be starting the 2023 Learning Exchange. So we got to work on our branding, I'd say, a little bit. We're trying to figure all that out, but it's a work in progress. But I think the biggest thing is in the last 5 years, over 200 new individuals and families under the age of, I guess, 45 or 50 have joined Toronto Foundation, many of them in their 20s, many of them in their 30s. Some of them would be in, kind of high earning careers, but many aren't as well. And it's quite a mix. And I think what's common for all is this idea that they want to be part of a learning experience and they really want to go deeper into that, not just alone, but alongside with other folks. This is a picture of the first cohort. We were doing something fun at the office while we were recruiting, where we were getting individual photos of folks, and we had this almost like in golf, there's that concept of a leaderboard where you'd have the pictures, and so we were kind of just doing something fun with that, and literally as we went along, there was 50 squares, and you can see like it really got a lot bigger than that. And some of you know Paul Nazareth in the philanthropic community, and that was his tweet on the day that we launched, which was really exciting as well. And this work has really transformed the work of the Community Foundation, and as a result, sort of a lot of the philanthropic conversations we've been getting into. We didn't have this at the start, but we developed this as we went on, and this now is the blueprint for a lot of the engagement that we are doing with families around Next Gen, and more broadly, just around kind of deeper philanthropic engagement. And it's really this idea of being guided by some objectives that really want to go deep into the areas that people want to be focused in on. On the slide previous, I had a word there, co-creation, and that for us is really critical as well. When we started this journey, we did not have it all mapped out, but we really spent a lot of time and continue to spend a lot of time working with donors and their families to find ways to kind of make this better and really focus in on the things that they are looking for and the things they want to accomplish. Small print, but this just gives you a sense of the curriculum. And so over the course of a year, there's a number of different touch points. Previously, they all used to be in person. Through COVID, we adapted to be more of an online journey. And then in the future, it'll be some combination of the two. I want to give you a sample of a couple of those workshops. One of them is a workshop we do around values, and I'm fairly certain Sherilyn's going to talk about 2164 a little bit. If not, I will right now.
I will now.
If you'd like to, sure. Well, later. Okay. So 2164 is an organization that we got some training with, and they helped us really understand this idea of going deeper into values. And we do this exercise with families. It's called Ground Your Giving, and we look at a few different elements that really gets people understanding what's driving their giving behaviors. And what's been really neat about that is when we do this with multi-generational families, it's really exciting to see what comes out of that and the conversations that then come as a result of various generations talking about what's driving their giving and sort of what has set them up to do that giving in the first place. And so it's a very foundational exercise that we find the families get a lot out of. We also spent a lot of time working on granting principles and really focused in on, and a lot of this is tied to the concepts of trust-based philanthropy and sort of ideas around giving unrestricted, giving multi-year, giving to small grassroots organizations. This is our focus at the Community Foundation. It doesn't have to be the focus of every single donor and family that we work with, but Next Gen, more and more, are really aligning with these kinds of principles. And so that's something that's really driving a lot of the agenda that we are working through with our families. Some of you may know, but at Toronto Foundation, we do a research report called Toronto's Vital Signs. It's kind of like a report card or an annual report for the city. It goes deep into 10 issue areas. And then out of that, we create things like this Good to Give guide, which is essentially a giving catalog that highlights a lot of grassroots organizations. So these are some of the tools that then once folks have a good sense of their values and have a good sense of their granting principles, they can go and find the types of organizations that they want to go deeper with and support. I'm going to ask our friends to come and join me now, and we've sort of we'll get into a bit of a conversation. I'm just going to grab my notes here. So joining me up here are first and foremost, Sherilyn Hale and Narinder Dhami. Sherilyn has been a friend in the philanthropic sector for a very long time, ever since I've been working here, and someone that I have looked at from afar and thought a lot about all the great work that you've done through the research, and then taking that to all this great work you're doing now with families. And so I'd love for you, Sherilyn, to share a little bit, just kind of off the top, about the work that you do and you know, how you want to set the stage for our remarks today.
Sure, thank you. Maybe before I do that, if I may, and the lights are very bright up here, you're right, Anil. It'd be helpful for me and possibly for both of you just to have a better sense of who's in the room.
Yeah.
So maybe just by a show of hands that we can barely see, a show of hands, who in the room would define yourself as a next-gen giver, next-gen philanthropist? Okay. Who in the room is part of a family, a generous family that may be multi-generational? Okay. All right. And who are maybe staff people, professional colleagues working with multi-generational families? Okay, so pretty much a mix of everyone. Is there anyone else? Is there another important group that I did not identify that you would like to be acknowledged in some way? Okay. All right. So I'm Sherilyn Hale. My company is Watermark Philanthropic Council, and I get to work with generous people all the time, and I love it. Typically, they're families. Sometimes they give through a private foundation, although not always. We know that donor-advised funds are the fastest growing charitable vehicle in Canada. I think what I have learned the last number of years doing this work is just how powerful philanthropy can be within families. And one of the things that I like to explore with families, obviously, is what do you want the impact of your giving to be in the community, but also what do you want this to make possible for your family, right? And as we talk about next gen engagement, and pulling all those threads together, that's a really important question. And my experience is that families often have very specific objectives that they want to accomplish, even if they haven't articulated them. And so the exploration piece, a lot of the work that I do is as a facilitator to help unearth what some of those objectives might be is a really important place to start. 2164, they're based in the US. They were actually seeded by the Bronfman family, who I think made such an incredible investment in the future of philanthropy. They're deeply committed to next generation givers, preparing them to engage in philanthropy in a meaningful way and within the context of their families. So I'm an advisor with 2164, but they have wonderful, fantastic resources that Anil has highlighted that support the kinds of conversations that really help families move things forward. One of the biggest criticisms for next-gen givers, and we're going to at some point actually define what we mean by next-gen, because there's no clear definition for that. But one of the biggest points of frustration that I often hear is they don't have a meaningful point of access, right? And so issues of power and voice within the family context can really be a factor as to how robustly they get to participate and in what ways. And so that's often an important area to delve in. Anil highlighted some research. So what do we know? We know that younger givers, they're very tech savvy. The way they define community is a little different than for those of us who are older. They've been exposed to philanthropy very early in their life, not just at home through parents, but at school. They tend to be more issue focused as opposed to institution focused. And how they go about giving and doing good really varies. And that's where some of the generational dynamics can come into play for a family that are working together. And I do think that's also an issue, a broader issue for the charitable sector to wrestle with, right? As the data seems to suggest giving is going down, the number of donors are going down. I think a lot of that is in part people are giving and doing good in many different ways, right? As opposed to just registered charities.
Right.
Just coming back to the benefits within a family of giving together. And when I say giving together, I mean that in the broadest sense. There's so many models, and I bet among you represent different models of how families can do that. One model that I think people usually think about is we're all going to come together, we're going to agree on set priorities, we're going to have to make decisions together and whatever. That requires a high degree of social capital within a family. It doesn't work for every family, and that's okay. That's just one model of doing it. But when I talk about giving together as a family, I think of that in a very broad context where the value of generosity and giving is paramount. It's a value that is shared across the family, and they have some mechanism for being able to support and advance that. So some of the things that I hear, particularly parents and grandparents, they want their kids to be good people, right? They don't want them to be negatively impacted, perhaps by all the advantages that can come from wealth, and in particular extreme wealth, right? And so they view philanthropy as a mechanism. It's not the be all and end all, but it can be a tool, a parental tool, a developmental tool, to encourage those values of empathy, compassion, generosity of spirit, and so that what you want philanthropy to accomplish within your family could be leadership development. You need to structure how you go about your giving in a way that helps to fulfill those objectives. And then I'll just end. The other hat that I wear in my life, in addition to my work, is as a researcher and an academic, a pracademic, I suppose is what I'm called, because I straddle both worlds. But did my doctoral research on governance and multi-generational family philanthropy here in Canada. I'm a big proponent of research and knowledge, because I think when we take the time to delve in and explore, look under the hood, poke and prod a bit, we get some insights that can help. Can help us understand better, do better, share better, communicate better. And for those of you in the space in Canada, there's such a lack of information in Canada about philanthropy. And so that was a personal commitment, personal and professional commitment and goal for me. But the experience of doing that and being able to apply that and share that with other families in a way that might help them was really important to me. So, thank you.
Thanks, Sherilyn. So now, Narinder, I'd love for you to share some words too. And just before that, so Narinder is wears many hats, as some of you may know, or you'll learn soon. Two sort of primary things to highlight. One being the founder and starter of an organization called New Power Labs, and then in addition, the executive director of the Sonar Foundation. Narinder is also a fund holder at Toronto Foundation and on the board of Community Foundations of Canada, and so brings a lot of different perspectives into this conversation, and I think will dovetail really well with the work that you're doing and the words you just shared. So please, Narinder.
Great. Well, thank you. Great to be here. And I'll just add, also on the board of the Circle, Chris, who's a phenomenal leader, and Anil spoke a little bit about their work as well, and a really great organization when it comes to the work we do and in partnership with Indigenous communities. So really great to be here. I'll start off with the role at Sonar Foundation and how we're structured and some of the work we're doing in terms of Next Gen. And then I'll talk and share a few trends that I see that are happening. There's another hat I wear is that I teach at the university a course on impact investing. And so I've been teaching anywhere from undergrad to master degree students. And there's, again, different viewpoint on how folks are thinking about merging meaning and money and the future of integrated capital approaches. So at the Sonar Foundation, we are, the parents in the 70s, the kids, if you could call them kids, are in the 40s, and then the grandkids are in the teen years. And so I've been working very closely with the grandkids around how do we think about their integration into philanthropy, into social impact. And so Becky, who is our chair, and I were speaking to Laura Lauder, it must have been about a year a bit ago. And she was talking about how she ingrained views and values within her family and that next generation. And they'd started a giving circle where each of the kids were empowered to explore an issue area that they were passionate about and engage and develop kind of a thesis on why this organization and this area and this space of the sector was worthy of a gift and kind of a need that should be addressed. And so what we did at the Sonar Foundation is we started a giving circle with the grandkids. And so I work with the grandkids. They each have to research issue areas that they care about, and then we go through a diligence process of evaluating what does the industry look like, who are the different charities working in the space, and we don't, and it's a lot of research on the children's to figure out, for the grandkids, to figure out what they're passionate about, understanding that there's many ways to address a problem, not only in the philanthropic sector, but there's businesses sometimes addressing those problems as well. And then they select one in which we will make a gift. We start in Thanksgiving, we end on Easter, they present to the family, and it's become, we did our first year last year, and it's become a really important way to get them to integrate and kind of start the conversation about the social sector, the issues that we're facing as a country in Canada, and slowly understanding our ability then as a foundation to play a role in supporting these phenomenal charities that operate across our country. So that's a piece of work that we're trying to think of, because I think, as you mentioned, it's so critical as we think about this next generation. And I define the next generation a little earlier in age as how we integrate them into the philanthropic work and ultimately, at some point, potentially the family office work. So that's kind of core of what we're doing at the Sonar Foundation when it comes to Next Gen. Now, broader trends that I see that are happening, and one is around impact investing. And I think you touched briefly on this, but there is a view that doing good doesn't always have to be just through philanthropy and to charities or nonprofits. And so that view is really shaping how we're thinking about our endowment. It's really shifting how I think many individuals are thinking about how they're investing their assets. And so this desire, again, merging profit and purpose is so ingrained in this next generation. The next piece, which again was touched on, was a new type of mental accounting. So it's no longer I give $1 or $10 here in philanthropy, and that is my gift. It's about how I live my life. It's about what I purchase. It's about, looking at different ways to give that might not be receipted. One trend, and I think folks probably know this, but if you care about climate change, one of the fastest ways to reduce greenhouse emission is to become a vegan. So that is part of kind of this mental accounting people are going through to understand, if I want to have a broad impact, what does that mean in terms of what I purchase, what I eat, where I place my money, and it doesn't. I think it's shifting beyond this more traditional sense of giving to charities and to nonprofits. So we're seeing this new mental accounting happening. And then the third one, which it gets me pretty excited, is to shake up the status quo. Now, it's not to say that other generations didn't do it, but I think that this next generation is more bold in some of their actions, or more bold in calling out the hypocrisy that can exist in the work that we do. I think about divestment. I think most folks here are familiar with divestment. I've always been a huge proponent of divestment. You could see the impacts of that in South Africa. We've only this year started to have that conversation of divestment because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, right? That was a widespread conversation we're having across our sector. But yet, we fail to have that conversation when it comes to what Saudi Arabia is doing, what Israel is engaged in, what the US is doing. So the next gen, and what I'm seeing this in the way I teach, in the students that I teach, in the conversations that I'm having, is that they're asking, why are we having a different set of rules for different countries? And I mention that because I think it's really important of a boldness. Are we living our views of equity? Are we actually engaging in a way which is treating everyone like equals? And that gets me excited, because I think the more we have these conversations, the more we kind of debate the value of every life, the more we're going to build that world that we want, which is more equitable, more prosperous for everybody.
All right. Thanks, Narinder. I have a couple notes from Tiffany that I just wanted to share, just to kind of place the viewpoint that we were hoping to have from her, and I think it'll be it'll fit in with this conversation. And you'll kind of understand why we wanted to have her here. So Tiffany, so the Chamandi Foundation was founded in 2015 by her parents, really to give back to the community. There was no official leadership, and there was really only personal gifts to large hospitals in and around Montreal until 2018, when Tiffany became the executive director. She was finishing her master's degree and wanted to work in a field that was helping people beyond sort of just volunteer work. And her parents trusted her to represent their interests through the philanthropy. And so since 2018, they've been building a team and donating to organizations, big and small, across Canada. And what was interesting for me, and the connection point specifically for my work, was the Chamandi Foundation is a separate standalone private foundation, but they also do work with the Fondation de Grand Montréal here in Montreal. And that is a really great connection and something that we're starting to do more of in Toronto as well. And I think there's a place for more and more of that across this country, where community foundations and private foundations can and should be doing more together, because there's a focus and an understanding and a knowledge base that a lot of community foundations have that's very local, that can really help to amplify and to help a private foundation go even deeper in areas that they want to be focused in on. During the first session yesterday morning, Emma and Beth were talking about this a little bit, around this idea of going deeper with education and learning. And of course, I'm wearing the community foundation hat, and I'm going to wave this flag, but what I would say is a lot of our foundations across the country are engaged in that work and really focused on the learning and the education that can help a lot of philanthropists. So increasingly, we want to be working more with and alongside private foundations, because we can help to amplify that and to sort of help it grow from the bottom up. So that's a little bit about Tiffany. I just want to see if there's some other things I'll mention later. But I mean, just sort of to get into it, is there anything that either of you said that sort of has sparked something that you want to go deeper into?
You made the comment about that developmental process, engaging young, exposing them to philanthropy. Part of that is about wealth stewardship, right? The responsible use of wealth and leadership around broader family office matters. I'm certainly seeing that. Philanthropy being that part of that developmental process, part of the curriculum to provide that. And I think from a governance, my thing is governance. I love governance. Is the governance geek, the other governance geek in the room? I met someone yesterday. Okay, she wasn't embarrassed at all. So if she was in the room, she would have identified herself. I just think governance is so fundamental to everything, life, but in the context of families and giving, because if you get those governance structures and process and relationships, if you get that right, it becomes a joy. And I think increasingly seeing the governance of philanthropy much more interconnected with the governance in other spheres of the family life, the other governance structures, certainly for very complex families, families with operating businesses as well. And I think one of the challenges that I see with families too is trying to figure out, how are people and the rising generation, how are they going to engage and in what ways, right? And how do we make those decisions in the context of a family foundation? And I'm sure this is not unfamiliar to some of you in the room. If you're a small nuclear family, it can be very self-evident who gets to participate and be involved. As the family diversifies and gets more complex, those decisions can get much more difficult, right? So there can be more interest in the family than there may be seats at the board table. So how do you build those structures and on-ramps and criteria so that you can honor the desire of those who want to participate in philanthropy in a meaningful way, whether or not that's a seat on the board. But what are the governance structures so that even seats come up, right? Was working with a foundation. They were in their multiple generations of the foundation, and the directors on the board had been on for 35 years, right? And it was time. It was time for to open up the windows and get other family members in. But they had lost an important window. All was not lost, but they had lost an important window years before to start planting the seeds, creating those on-ramps, giving some exposure so people can, the next generations, which may or may not be related to age, and maybe we can go there, but so that there's meaningful points of access, on-ramps, and also exits. Joining the family's philanthropy. It may not be for your whole life. Issues of age and stage, when you can have a meaningful amount of time to focus, I think is an important part of the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, and we've in conversations with a number of other family offices and family foundations, those on-ramps can be can be quite diverse. Whereas some individuals figure out pathways in the family office first, and then you can earn the opportunity to go into the philanthropic side. Others use philanthropy as the first on-ramp, and then entering into the family office side. The diversity of how this could be structured to ensure that not only are the kids set up for success, but then the value that they can bring is cultivated and it is structured in a way that's helpful for either opportunity.
Such a good point. You all know this. Every family is different, right? Your values, the norms, how a family relates to each other, the complexity of the family, the heritage of the family, the identity of the family, all of those things. So there's no one size fits all, right? Come up with adapt a model that may work for someone else. You can't do it. It really has to emerge from the family. To identify what suits them in that context and based on what their objectives are.
Yeah, which links to a really interesting conversation about endowments and what is that next generation thinking about endowments, because there is diversity across that. There's diversity across our sector as well. But I do think that the conversation needs to be had, regardless of if we agree or disagree. I think until we have that conversation, that's, again, where I get excited about this next gen, and whether or not you consider Becky, who is mid-40s, I don't think she'll mind me telling her age, mid-40s, or her kids, whichever kind of layer you consider next gen. I think that the conversation of endowments is something that is received in a way that's healthy. That is, regardless of if we agree or disagree, let's have that conversation, because there's values. There could be opportunities of why endowments are important, but there's also a lot of reasons why rethinking the endowment model can have tremendous amount of impact.
Yeah. I want to share, so I talked about earlier, in the last 5 years, we've welcomed close to 200 plus new younger donors. It's interesting, like I was surprised to see this, but easily 25 to 30% of them actually did set up endowments with us. We don't have a rule that you have to come and set up an endowment at the community foundation. We have spend down funds. We have a whole range, and I've asked some of them just sort of to really understand what's going on there, and because my assumption was that a certain age group just would not want an endowment in the way that they've traditionally been done. And I think some of the things that are trending in that direction that I guess were checking boxes for them. One was the work that we've been doing around socially responsible investing and really trying to change how our endowments are invested. And I think for some of these young people, they wanted to be a part of that because they wanted they wanted their money, while the granting dollars were important to them to be giving away to the charities that they care about. They also wanted to make sure that the money was being stewarded and invested in appropriate ways that were aligned with their values. And that's a journey that we're on as an organization to kind of keep moving in that direction. And we've heard some of those conversations in the last couple of days. The other thing that was a motivating factor for many of these young people was this idea of longevity and this idea of family legacy. In the case of Becky, I think of families that we have and individuals where they're in their late 30s, early 40s. They're starting families. They've got young children, and they are starting to think about, well, my kids right now are 5, 10 years old, but when they are in their 20s and their 30s, et cetera, like, I want this thing to still be around, and I want this thing to be, a tool for our family. And so it's interesting. Like, I have conversations with the generations in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who are kind of having the conversations with their kids in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then the grandkids. But I'm also having conversations with where I guess the G1 in the philanthropy, the generation 1, is the 30, 40-year-old. And then it's sort of their kids would be the G2, which it's very interesting just to see how the trends are different as that plays out. I don't know if, Sherilyn, with the work that you're doing with families, are you seeing conversations that they're having around the investments of their endowments or of their philanthropic assets, and how, like, who's driving those conversations?
Mm-hmm. Well, it varies. I think it's actually an area where I tend to see the biggest generational variation in terms of philosophy and approach. So all the way, on one end of the continuum, either the wealth creator or the senior levels of the family are, we are going to invest the money as aggressively as is prudent. We're going to make as much money as possible, and then we can do more good, right? So that's over here. And then the younger generations, really all the things that you were talking about, right? Like, can we be doing this differently? Can we be doing this better? And so when it's on that type of dichotomy, it's very difficult to bridge. So what I've seen is a bit more compromise, where we'll have a portion that will pilot in this way, or no compromise, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, but there are consequences to not compromising too, which is worthy of exploration. But so yeah, I think that's one of the areas where I see the greatest generational divide. And maybe I'll just add, if it's appropriate here, as we talk about next gens and older donors, and there's so much variation, and I always have to just remind myself, these are broad operational categories that may help us understand what's really happening a bit better. But I think we all have to just caution ourselves. We never want to stereotype people. Like, I'm 48. I don't know, what am I? Am I a next gen? Am I an old person? Am I a dinosaur? I don't. Right. So there are trends that help. But I've worked with families where, honest to goodness, they were really aligned across 3 generations. There were no stumbling blocks, and to how they were coming together, the ways in which they engaged with each other, their decision making. So I wouldn't want to set this up in a conflictual kind of way. Of course, there's conflict. It happens. It could be based on generation. It can be based on lots of other factors. Families are very complex. We come together in many different ways. How we even define family can look very different. And so I think all of those factors have to be accounted when we think of how can philanthropy be a tool for good in the community and also within our families. And then one last comment, next gen donors, younger donors, they don't just appear out of magic, right? They're cultivated. They're cultivated by parents and grandparents and teachers at school who talk about generosity and giving. I've spoken with so many I've been in the giving space, the philanthropy space for 30 years, and I'm still so young. But 30 years, and people tell me, because I ask, what motivates your generosity? Why is it important to you to give and to engage and participate? And more often than not, they tell a story about a parent or a grandparent or some other special person in their life that was a model, was an example, even in the absence of wealth, right? So they may not have come from wealth. Maybe they made their own. And so I think that's just another, as we try to define next gen donor, how do we engage them? I think fundamentally we do that by engaging them, by involving them, by modeling the type of values and behavior that we want to see. Starting when they're 30, maybe too late, right? To get the greatest impact.
Yeah. I'll add is the gender, the transfer of wealth, the enormous transfer of wealth to women is also, I'm seeing, having a different impact in the way the next phase of philanthropy, I believe, will roll out. Whether it's linking and a deeper appreciation of gender lens, investing, whether it's looking at things with greater intersectionality. I think there is also this huge power and opportunity that we're going to see as that transfer of wealth goes to the hands of women.
Yeah, agreed.
Are there any, I've got lots more to get into, but why don't I just check and see if there's any kind of comments or questions that folks in the audience have, that if you want to sort of engage in the conversation at all? I should have planted something. Oh, there we go.
I don't know how you're seeing anything.
Yeah.
All I
Yeah,
see is
this is
stars.
bright.
Hi, I'm Seth Asimakis. I'm from an intermediary called Kaleidoscope in St. John, New Brunswick. I guess what I didn't hear, it sounded like there was a lot of reconciliation of ideas within a fund or a foundation, but also I assume what might be happening as well is that the next generation decides to set up their own foundation and pursue things that are a bit more riskier, but have bigger potential impacts on systems and so on. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that, if you're seeing that type of thing happening as well.
Yeah. So with our family, we have one main family foundation, but that doesn't exclude each of the children. So the 40, kind of that range of 40-year-old children, to engage in their own work outside of that. So different approaches, different issue areas that might be outside of that. And we are thinking, because we are planning, what is that longer 10, 20, 30-year journey for the Sonar Foundation, and recognizing that there may be opportunities and a desire to do different things. So how do we think about structuring that? How do we think about enabling that? We're still early in that journey because of that change we think will be more apparent in the grandkids versus the kids. And kids I'm using as my age, kind of 40 to 50-year-olds, versus versus the definition of kids. So we are planning that. We're not there yet. So I'm curious about what you've seen in terms of, I know that there is often, as families grow, that compartmentalization of different funds within a foundation.
Yeah, there's so much variation. So I've seen families use donor-advised funds. So they'll have the main foundation structure, and that will be for kind of the collective priorities. It's in the name of the family, and then set up donor-advised funds for individual family members. So that's one approach. There's another family that did the reverse. They were the family made their wealth in a particular community in Canada. They set up a very, very large donor-advised fund at a community foundation because it was important for them to have that presence in the community. And then the private foundation was actually for the discretionary giving among the family members. So I think there are different ways to structure it. I do work outside of Canada, primarily in the Caribbean. Issues of structure look very different there. And people there, the clients that I tend to work with there are global citizens. They have multiple structures in multiple jurisdictions. So for me, purpose comes before structure, right? And so if you're clear about what your purposes are, what you want to accomplish, what the long-term objectives are, then you can make better choices about what structure will best serve us. And for many families, it's just a foundation, and that's great. For others, there may be more diversified approaches based on what their objectives are.
I just want to touch on the community. I have seen that in some of the families that I'm speaking to, that they have the Next Gen set up separate DAFs at community foundations, because not only do they have a bit more control in many ways in how they give, but they find a peer group. And I think, Anil, this goes to the work that you're doing,
Yes.
is you have a peer group, which is so critical when you're trying to figure out your voice, your why, and the how in which you want to have an impact.
Yeah, and I'll build on both of these answers just to say, so a concrete example, last March, so the wealth creator in their 80s, when they passed, they had left about, I think the number was $6 million to their grandkids. So there was 4 grandkids. Well, the wealth creator has 4 kids, and it's the grandkids or the kids of those kids. So all the grandkids are kind of in their 20s, and so that $6 million was meant to be used by those grandkids, and it was sitting in the wealth creator's private foundation. What the 4 kind of 60-year-olds did was they took that $6 million and brought it to the community foundation and set up 4 $1.5 million donor advised funds. And then their kids are in charge of those donor advised funds. And it's a way for them to learn, use the tools, be part of a network. And that's sort of a structure that, is kind of playing out in real time now. To Sherilyn's point, it happens the other way as well. So we have examples where typically, especially sort of end of year, somebody wants to do something and can't get the private foundation set up in time. So they set up a donor advised fund because they can get that sorted from a tax perspective. But then they kind of they buy themselves some time and they create some runway and they get to actually sort of learn and be part of something. And eventually, if they decide to set up a private foundation, they can move some of those assets over if and when they choose to do that. What we've observed time and time again is we hear from a lot of folks that when they have a private foundation, sometimes they're looking for that sense of community. And so that's where an organization like PFC comes in. TPW, the Philanthropy Workshop, has been referenced through this conference. They're another group that I would encourage folks to look into. And then the local community foundation is also a great model where, again, you're just finding others that you can give alongside with. Maybe you share a purpose, you share values, and you can start seeing how together you can amplify one another and do even more. So some of those networks really do help. Any comments or?
I was talking with a family
Yeah.
recently, a business family, and they're making a decision. What are we going to do as a family? And one of the things they're wrestling with is, we spend a lot of time together already, right, on the business. Do we also want to set up a foundation and spend more time together? Love you, but right?
Yeah.
So again, I think there's no one size fits all, and it needs to just suit where the family is at and what they're wanting.
Yeah. Please.
Well, by the way, hi, Anel. I'm Michael from Germany, from
Hello,
Berlin.
Michael.
And for myself, so this all sounds very harmonious, what you're describing. What I'm experiencing right now in Europe is that next generation are going in arguments with their parents. And they're actually trying to get paid out. And they're setting up their own foundations, or There's one very prominent member of one of the wealthiest families in Germany who went public in an interview and said foundations are really the worst. And you shouldn't do foundations, you should spend the money now. I would like, how do you, because these, especially on climate change, there are these conflicts. And Narinda referenced becoming a vegan, but some of the people,
personal.
yeah, some of the people I work with, they fund rebellion extension, and think about resource generation and like how do you, because that must be stress for a family to manage that kind of fundamental difference in what is going to change the world.
Yeah, I want to share a quote. Are folks familiar with Robin Hood Foundation in the U.S.? They do some really interesting work. They actually raise money from a big gala they run, and it's like they raise, I think, $100 to $200 million every gala, and then they deploy it back directly into community every year. And we had the CPO in a previous role I was in come to Canada, and she was talking about the programs and what they do and their approach, which is much more venture philanthropy. And she was saying, why save for a rainy day when it's pouring outside? And this concept of like, why are we keeping the capital in endowments when there's so many issues? And I do feel that sentiment. I share that quote because that sentiment I've seen in this kind of next generation of individuals thinking about the impact they can have. And so it's also thinking beyond that scarcity mindset, is wealth is always going to be recreated. We're always continuing to create wealth. So again, that long-term perpetuity approach may not always be as relevant. But I think you raised a really good point because we are saying things that are good. Now, I am in a good situation because we all get along, the family, and we've aligned on an approach that makes sense for folks. But I do think that there is, in this next generation, one of the big risks, and you've articulated this, but is the way in which sometimes also the family office operates and what they're investing in. This kind of next generation is like, wait, if we're talking about climate change and we're invested in oil, like what is that? What are we doing? And so there is, I think, this growing tension that can exist. I have not had to deal with it, thankfully, but I think that that's where it's like, how do you manage as a family to have these difficult conversations? And we definitely have conversations on endowment, perpetuity, and impact investing, which are interesting, but we haven't gone into that more contentious space. I think that there's different ways to address it, and the more that next generation pushes, the more we can get to a solution that is more sustainable for the world. So I think it's a healthy discussion and debate, but it may not always be received that way. Are you seeing that type of tension in the?
Not to the degree that Michael is highlighted. Certainly, conflict comes up. Anytime you have more than one person trying to do anything, there's going to be some variation. One of the things that I found in my research was the whole concept of social capital. Right, and it's it's applied in any social environment, but particularly in the family space, and this comes out of the family enterprise literature. That as you come together as a group to do stuff together, make decisions together, even if it's difficult, you're strengthening your muscles, right? Your social capital muscles, so that the next time something comes up that's difficult or contentious, you have greater capacity to be able to address that, right? So social capital being your shared ideas around the world, about the world, behaviors, values, and so forth, right? And some groups have higher degrees of social capital than others, but you can build it, you can grow it. I think your point, Michael, is an interesting one that is also informed by the stage of the family, right? I think it's very different talking about how dad made the money or how grandpa made the money versus how our ancestors in the 5th, 6th, or in Europe, the 20th generation, 20 generations before, how they made the money. So I think that proximity to the wealth creation can inform the degree of conflict, right, in wrestling with those issues and the expectations of those who are participating and around the table.
I do apologize. I think that was my phone. It just it listens to everything
Japanese
I do.
dictionary. Michael, it's a really, really important question, and I know kind of in the community foundation space, at least from my perspective in Toronto, we have not had to experience that so much, but I think it's sort of it's kind of connected to like when a family is choosing to be at a community foundation, maybe they've already made some of those choices, and so it's a bit different. But I think it's really critical that tension is so important, and it really does have to drive the change that we want to see. And I hate putting it on the young people all the time, but like we have to keep saying those things, and we have to keep kind of standing up for those things, and we are going to get shut down because generally the control lies where it lies. But I think we just have to keep pushing, because otherwise the change cannot happen. And it's kind of connected to a bit of the debate that was happening in the first session yesterday around the books, and like the conversation around the critiques of philanthropy, and really like the only way things can change and keep getting better for more of us and more of the communities that we're trying to serve is by having those critiques and having those questions and raising those things, because otherwise it'll just sort of go status quo. And so that push is so important, and I appreciate you highlighting that, Michael.
And this is also why I appreciate so much both PFC and I would say CFC and others who've come out with very holistic approaches of the future. So I think it's like we need to get out of this comfort zone of what we have today is what we should always have. And this is, again, what gives me hope of the next generation of really pushing. Whether it's, and this, again, I think the consistency of both PFC and CFC is great around, like, how do we rethink the future? How can we have the greatest impact? Does this look like an endowment? What does our impact investing portion look like? How do we broadly invest our assets? And all of these really important conversations, I would say, are critical if we want to make sure that next generation is engaged and in part of that journey of impact with us.
I think the other, I mean, not to be contrarian, but it's also, is this my money or is it our money?
Yeah.
And that's often a question that I don't think families, as they come together to give, right? They may kind of step around it, right? But I think getting clear about that is really important.
The my
if
money.
it's my
Or is
money,
it public money because you've received a tax receipt, and now is it public money?
right? Is it my
Yeah.
foundation,
Yeah.
right? Where
Yeah.
I'm making the decisions.
Yeah.
But you're invited to watch, right?
Yeah.
That's a very different scenario than we're going to do this together.
Right.
We're going to come up with a way for how we're going to make decisions together. So the degree of voice, I think families have to get very clear about that, because if there's a lack of clarity, there's confusion and conflict.
The my money, our money conversation is important too, especially when you layer in the generations previous, right? So your example previously about, is this 20 generations back? Because then it's like it's none of their money, and so then like what's the collective versus the person who just sold their startup last week and started it, and they're the founder. It's their money now. They have young kids that they're starting a foundation with, but like that's a different example than 20 generations back, even 5 generations back. So it's a good point.
And and also, like, is it public money? Because I think it's when you get a tax receipt and it moves into the philanthropic world, what is that level of accountability that happens? Because you've actually received the kind of the value of that amount of gifting that is happening. And so in this public sphere, and this gets to Beth's point where I have a conflict with some of her viewpoints, but
She's right there.
Oh, hi, Beth. We'll talk later. But it is around, like, what is the accountability structure within philanthropy, within family philanthropy? And without that, are we truly being the best we can be? Yeah. Which is where I pause.
And I've worked with a beautiful family for a number of years. Their daughters are now in their 20s. And the parents are lovely human beings. They really want their daughters to be engaged, but I had to spend time with the daughters because they felt this was their parents', it was funded from their parents' money. And so, as they're talking around the table and making decisions, they were a bit timid, right? Giving their opinions and not, they kind of wanted to defer to what they thought their parents might, even though their parents were like, no, like we really, we really want to know what you think. We're equal partners in this. So, and that's a choice, and it also reflects family norms, right? About how they exist with each other. So all of these issues are very complex in the family sphere, and they look very different. But to be able to name it and have conversations around it can help families make better choices, better for their family, better for the community.
Hi. Actually, kind of coming off of this whole thing of accountability, and to Narinda's point, I work at a private family foundation founded by a wealthy couple. Somehow found me, we had a chat, our values aligned, and they said, "You want to build this up?" And we notionally say that, and it's notionally, that the Canadian public is the 25% shareholder of the North Pine Foundation, because if you look at the offset of the capital gains and the charitable receipt, that's essentially their ownership of the North Pine Foundation and kind of any kind of foundation. But that's notionally. In actuality, the Canadian public interest is articulated through CRA regulations. We could talk about what we want to do individually as a foundation, what our good intentions might be to operate of what we think is effective philanthropy that keeps ourselves accountable. But the true accountability arm is the CRA to this. So I think there needs to be a big public policy conversation of what philanthropy looks like in Canada. I am desperately looking for the framework that gets me fired from my job for not making impact. And what is it that fuels the work that actually creates impact? And I think Michael might appreciate the whole concept of how do we go from effective philanthropy to accountable philanthropy that's driven on impact, because I'm hoping if we figure that out, all these other things about family quarrels or good intentions or whatever it might be, regardless, we fuel what's doing good work that is accountable at least 25% to the broader Canadian public. But that's kind of like the desperate question I'm trying to answer for myself.
Thanks,
Your
Atif.
point about governance is an important one, and I think my lens the last number of years in terms of governance within private foundations, I think there's a lot of work to do to understand that framework, but also to take those responsibilities seriously, right? That it's not just about us around the table. And I often talk about the blend between the corporate governance and the family governance. If it is just a family, they need to wrestle with the dynamics of a family, how they come together, how they make decisions in order for it all to work, right? But I do think it's an area where more education, more support, more training, and just to understand how important that governance is. The other piece of that, which we haven't mentioned, that is, and I find it interesting, the tension between we're wanting to do this as a collective family experience, but we also want to hear the voices from those outside our family, right? And depending on why a family sets up the foundation, what they want it to accomplish for their family, it doesn't always make sense to have external people on the board. In some cases that may be, but what are the other mechanisms that they can get that input, that data, so that they're not making decisions in isolation. It can't just be about what the family wants and is interested in. It has to link to the broader world. And I think that's worthy of exploration for every foundation.
Atif, your comment got me thinking about two things. One was, so last year, and Sarah, you were a part of this when you used to work with us. We ran a grant stream called the Black and Indigenous Futures Fund, and part of that grant stream, the whole idea of it was to support non-qualified donees, which was something new that we Am I doing that? Maybe I'm doing that. Sorry. So the idea really was to, so historically, we can only grant to a qualified donee, and that's kind of the rules of the CRA. As a community foundation, we're able to get into a sort of a trustee relationship with a non-qualified donee. So there was a lot more kind of work and hoops and things to fall through, but we were able to do it where we could then flow funds to non-registered charities. And I mean, that's the starting point for us, and it was a test and it worked, and so we want to do more of that now. The next stage will be to how do we do that with, how do we engage our donors to be able to do that with their money and think of ways to sort of go more broadly with the giving. The other thing I think about from a policy perspective is so right now, the tax receipt that somebody gets is the same tax receipt whichever qualified donee you give to. We look at the statistics and we see that nearly 70% of giving is only going to 1% of the charities, and we kind of understand where all the needs are, et cetera, from the research. I mean, could we imagine a world where there was a different tax treatment? So when you gave to, one of the biggest charities, you got that receipt, but you were incentivized through tax receipts to actually give to the smaller, more grassroots organizations, and like maybe you get a double receipt. I don't know. I'm not that on that side of it, but I just wonder about how we can use policy to drive the kind of change that we actually want to see and that we need. So that's just some thoughts. But
hello, Sylvie. I'm a Next Gen with a private family foundation. And one thing that strikes me about the conversation and the way that we're structuring it is all about how do we engage the next gen? How do we get them engaged? We want to make sure that they're like generous and good people and everything else. But Anil, when you had your slide with all of sort of the values that that are part of your program that appeal to the next gen, those are also the values and the ways of thinking that where I think philanthropy is going and being challenged to go further and to drive impact and to look at the systemic changes. So I would almost flip it and say, how can the next gen engage the first gen to rethink also and go beyond just the very traditional institutional, put your name on a building, which we do also in our family foundation, but how can next gen be also used as a lever to have those conversations within the family, the conversations even from like, yeah, let's fund Extinction Rebellion, we're in a climate crisis, like we need all the tools at the table. And not being that something that's scary and let's put a box around it and oh my God, but be like, oh yeah, actually there was a responsibility there, and it's possible to like go across those generations to be like, there was an interesting session yesterday with, how to fund youth groups, and there was like a stats that young people sort of peak with their innovation. So like other things improve over age, but innovation peaks at like 24 or something like that, then goes down. So I'm on the tail end of, on the other side of that. But young people have good ideas. We're not just there to teach them. They can also teach us stuff that's useful.
Really
Just
important.
Such a great point.
You've
Thank
seen
you.
about that.
I think the key word, one of the key words of what you just said was the conversation, right? And that's, Anil talked about 2164. Their model is all about values-based conversation, right? And if you're not going to engage and have conversation, you can't get to where you're talking. And that takes a willingness to listen, a willingness to engage. Then the other thing I'll say, there's young wealth creators who are setting up funds and foundations, who are engaging their parents in their philanthropy too, right? So it's not always top down from that perspective.
For sure, for us, with a lot of the individuals that we've engaged through our learning programs, many of them are the wealth creator in the family. And what's been really interesting is that as we have engaged the 20 and 30-year-olds in some of these journeys, what ends up happening is I get an email or a phone call from their parents who say, hey, my kid is doing this thing. They've told me about it. I'm interested to learn more and figure out how I can do something. I'm thinking about my legacy. I'm thinking about a bequest. And so it is kind of going in that direction as well. I absolutely agree, Sylvie. Like, I want more of that because I think it's the right model. But I know from our perspective, there's a bit of like a Trojan horse kind of idea, right? Like, I think we want to go in wherever we can and then, try to make it work either up or down.
One of the areas I see where the change is happening upwards, like this next gen is changing, is on reconciliation, a shared recognition of what our actual history is with Indigenous communities in Canada. I see kind of the under 50 next gen group actually helping to inform those, and many folks who didn't go through the same education that we go through to understand what that journey has been for Indigenous communities. So that's kind of one hope I see on that kind of reverse learning. We're doing some work. So actually, one of the grandkids, did a challenge. Her focus was on 2S LGBTQ2+. Actually, and there's a really worrying stat. In the US, there's more funding going to anti-LGBTQ+ organizations that are fighting against this than for organizations that support these communities. We don't have the same data at Canada, because if you've heard me speak before, we don't collect good disaggregated data on anything, but I imagine that a similar trend exists here in Canada. So one of the areas we're going to go deep into next year is how do we support the social determinants of health of the trans community across Canada, and that actually stemmed from a conversation and some research we did at the kind of grandkid level that recognize an extremely underfunded community across Canada that's overlooked by most foundations today. So.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the great session. So, I loved hearing what you've all talked about, us, our money, my money, the role of responsible impact investing. So I'm asking, just for disclosure, I sit on the board of PFC, advise a few foundations, sit on investment committee for a few, and hear a few different conversations. Something I've heard from a few friends and colleagues who come from, affluent family is they have engaged, they talk about, they have, educated and everything. It's a second generation family, and there is a lot of push-pull. And finally, they're getting pushed back, being like, hey, at the end, it's our money. That generation is more like, oh, you know what? This is how we made money. We are thinking, maximize return, and then we'll grant. And what I have noticed is some of these are actually leading to bad personal relations within the family. Not my thing to monitor or, advise on. So what would be one advice each of you would give to someone like that who is facing the frustration of how do I, I've engaged, I've educated. They're like, should I have to wait until it comes to my, will? So what would your recommendation be to those people who are trying to bring their, parents along or whoever the money is and facing a lot of pushback? So one advice from each of you, that would be great. Thank you.
So I can kick it off. So the one strategy that I've seen work is piloting. So let's carve out a small pilot. So you and I may disagree, but let's carve out a small pilot. Maybe it's $1 million in impact investing. Let's play it out for a few years. But it could be a good strategy to shift the perception of risk, but also then give more responsibility to the person who's trying to push that new area with a bucket of contained capital.
Yeah, that's a great example. It doesn't always work in every family context, but my default is family first, right? Philanthropy doesn't solve broader issues in a family. So where I've seen the most conflict, they wasn't related to philanthropic strategy, right? There were other things going on with the family, and sometimes I see families want to set up a foundation to save the family, right, or to heal what's broken, right? I don't think that's the best place to start. And if any endeavor is really high conflict, certainly in the philanthropic space, my suggestion, and I've given referrals for either a mediator or a counselor, family therapy, and I say that with a very genuine heart, right? Because there's something we haven't actually said it up here. There's something very special about families, right? And those relationships, they can be wonderful, they can be fractured, they can be, you name it, right? In the context of philanthropy, philanthropy can't solve everything. Be all and end all is a tool. It's a platform. So I don't know if that is a great suggestion for your friend and colleague. Sorry?
That's where both the suggestions are very helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello? Oh, sorry. Did you want to give a piece of advice?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, is
You get the mic.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I really like the piloting example. That's something that we have been doing a lot of over the years at Toronto Foundation. I think for me, MJ, the way the thing I always come back to, the touchstone for me is values, and in any scenario like that, like I would really encourage folks to do some version of a values analysis, and it's really critical to do it individually and then come together and kind of find the common threads and find the places where there is not commonality, but then like sort of have the right questions to be able to talk through, okay, so now that we have this, like what can we do with that? But that we've seen that with a lot of examples of families, of definitely multi-generations, where that ability to go deep into their values, first individually, then as a family, really does help to guide a lot of those conversations.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Neria. I work for the Jimmy Pratt Foundation in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's a private family foundation. There's a number, as we all know, wealth building and maintaining is complicated, but there's the main donor and the next generation, her kids are on the board as well. And they're a pretty progressive family. I mean, they hired me when I was 24 to guide as the ED, to guide their work on children and youth, which that's a big kind of leap of faith, but that a lot of families might not be comfortable with. But I think my question is a little bit related to MJ's, and it pertains to staff. Like, what are I think there's obviously a power differential between the folks who build the wealth and then the next generation, but then where does staff fit in with all that? There's kind of a power dynamic in family philanthropy that's impossible to eliminate at the end of the day, because I think, like, Sherilyn said, blood's thicker than water, right? Family first. And even though as a staff person, I might be equally invested in the goals of the foundation, ultimately it is a family endeavor. And so I would just ask, and even with the kind of best, most understanding and introspective families, there always is going to be that difference. Not to say that, and I don't think it can be eliminated, but what advice would you give to staff working in family foundations?
So I'm a staff who works in a family foundation. So I'm the president of the Center Foundation. Now, our story is a little unique in the sense of Michael, who's a father, invested in a project I was working on about a decade ago, and through that became a mentor of mine. He introduced me to his daughter, Becky. She's a good friend of mine. So it's a unique situation. I'm not going to say it's not a unique situation, but I do think the way in which what the strategy I've used is just to have a lot of clarity in process, clarity in approval process, clarity in who owns what, clarity in the role of the board, clarity in the role of each family member. And the more that we've clarified that, the more seamless it has become. Now, again, I would say I'm a unique situation because I do know every family member, and it came through a project they invested in me about a decade ago. And so there was this longer-term journey of getting to know them before they asked me to join the family foundation. That would be my advice. Clarity, processes, get it down on paper, get a good strategy, and then work off of that and reference that as you make decisions and make proposals.
And Neil just whispered, governance.
Oh, and governance. Yeah,
that is
as
governance.
part of governance.
Yeah.
Like, it is governance. Yeah.
No, you took the words
Yeah.
out of my,
Yeah.
I'd be curious. I know that there are others in the room that also work with families, family foundations. Any other advice that you would offer from the audience?
Great question, and one piece that I have accepted and learned is at the end of the day, it's not my money. It's I'm working on the asset management side, and my profession values all those pieces, but just accepting that at the end of the day, I'm a shepherd of someone's capital, and there is, as you said, that dynamic, that power equation is not going to change. So I have to say la vie. I have to accept it is what it is. Do my part, do the best, and that's acceptance of that has helped me. Where there are times when I would recommend something and it may not align with their values or their vision of the future, and at the end it is their money, so not helpful, but that's at least helped me found peace.
And maybe just to touch on it, and it's how do you show up? When I show up, I bring all of myself, which is my progressiveness, my engineer in me, everything I bring. And so I'm very comfortable of showing up as who I am fully. And I think that enables us to have these deeper discussions on equity, on tough issues, on endowments, on impact investing. But I choose to show up as all of me, which is including the very progressive side of me.
Yeah, thanks. This is Paula. Narendra, I'm just going to build on that. I think we've been talking about what Next Gen can do to bring change in, but I was a staff member at a large family foundation. Now I'm a family advisor at a bank, but we can also be that voice of what's new, what's coming up. And even though they might have a foundation, one of the Next Gen, I work a lot with families where the Next Gen actually want to start a social enterprise. So it's completely outside of any of these philanthropic structures, or even setting some parameters around impact investing to say, yeah, actually, some of the trends are 10% of your assets in impact investing. So bringing in, like you say, progressive, new, in sometimes you have a unique role as a staff member to challenge, what the family might be doing in a kind of safe space. So, I'm not sure how much you do that with the family, sort of bring in kind of challenging or, sort of ideas, but.
Michael and I love to debate, so it works out great.
All right, well, thanks. This has been a great panel. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you. And so I think we're at the end. Really just wanted to give a big thanks to both Sherilyn and Narinder for joining us today, and for all of you. So have a great rest of your morning, and I think break now. Session next session's in 15 minutes, half an hour. Okay. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil.
Thank you.